Okay, Bob, it's all yours.
Thank you. So, just to talk about the second step, that really has to do with, are you even willing to believe? And doesn't take much. People normally talk about mustard seeds right about in there. And the mustard seed is such a small object that it's a very small grain, and that's all you need. And all it requires is a very, very small amount of faith, small amount of belief to get started, and that's plenty. And then it asks you to make a decision about whether you think God is or He isn't. And then it says something odd and something meaningful, and that is God is either everything or He's nothing. One of the challenges that we have in emotional sobriety is our ability to totally lose perspective. Almost every drunk I've ever met has a tendency to take a set of circumstances and go to the worst possible conclusion instantaneously. So we'll take a piece of information, and then all of a sudden we will go to this catastrophe and start building a house there. And emotional sobriety is understanding, at least in my experience, is understanding that my mind is playing tricks on me. And that as much as I try and as much as I grow in understanding and effectiveness, that is something that can happen to me at any moment. And one of the reasons why the 10th step is so important is because we call someone else and tell them if we're in selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, or fear, and then they will, if they're good at the 10th step, will say, did you ask God to remove it? Do you owe someone an amend? Did you turn your thoughts to someone you can help? Okay? And then they'll give you some perspective. And they'll go, that's crazy, Bob. What you're thinking there is not anywhere close to the truth. How could you possibly have gotten to that conclusion? And you go, well, you know my mind because you got one just like me. And then they'll say, well, here's what's probably reasonable. And then all of a sudden, I am not challenged by my own lack of perspective. But we have this ability to take information and just go to the worst places. And one of the indications of good emotional health is understanding that we have the type of mind that does that. Now, one of the things that saves me under those circumstances is this. Things are rarely what they seem to be. All right? If I understand that I have a lack of perspective, even if that's offensive to me because I think I have a good mind, I will understand that I see things probably not the way they are. And so I will draw conclusions, and those conclusions usually don't have to do with right now. Those conclusions have to do with tomorrow or next week. And I will draw this scenario about what's coming down the road. And none of it looks good. Okay? I don't draw conclusions about I'm going to be terribly successful, make a lot of money, and meet the woman of my dreams. Those are not my conclusions. My conclusions is everything's going to hell in a handbasket. I'm gonna lose everything that I have, and I'm going to be living under a bridge. That's where my head goes. But I understand today that that things are rarely what they seem to be. Now, if you tell yourself that, and you're gonna have to accept the idea that your perception may be a little faulty, and but it will save you a lot of frustration if you look at it and say, I don't think I see the truth here. And I don't know what the truth is, but I'm thinking it's not what I see. Then you don't have to go off half-cocked about whatever the circumstances are. So 2 things that have been really important to me in emotional sobriety. Number 1 is I do have a perception problem, and it's not unusual. I mean, most people have perception problems. And the other one is things are rarely what they seem to be. So that'll save you a lot of wear and tear, okay? And then just kind of hang around and see what it really is. And frankly, I'm going through that right now in my business because I've got some challenges that I have to go back to next week that could have some major influence on my business. And I can make a great big deal out of it, or I can go back and do the right thing. And at some point, I have to turn to God. One of the most popular things for years around Denver AA was this: the hardest thing about trusting God is trusting God. See, if you were brought up in my generation, and most of you that aren't that old, but if you were brought up in my generation, we were brought up on self-sufficiency. All the radio programs were like Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, and we listened to Batman and Superman and the Lone Ranger and all the rest of this stuff on the radio and early television, and it was all about self-sufficiency, and it was all about superheroes, and it was about Wonder Woman and and all these people that absolutely were invincible. And we were brought up to emulate those people. And that meant that we had to go out and do this ourselves and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and it's you that's going to determine whether you're going to be successful, and you just have to try harder, and you have to win. In spite of anything. And we grew up on Vince Lombardi, and where he said winning was the only thing. And so we grew up with this idea that try harder, work smarter, win at any cost. Just plow your way through there until it happens. And then you come into Alcoholics Anonymous and they tell you, let go and let God. And you're going, fuck you. All of a sudden they're saying, let God do it. And you're going, I don't think so. I don't think God's interested. That's agnosticism. That's why there's a book chapter in Alcoholics Anonymous that's called We Agnostics. Because we all suffer from periodic agnosticism. And so we're sitting there and people are saying you're going to need to trust God. Here's my experience. We will not trust God unless there's no other alternative. Unless we have exhausted every resource, we won't turn to God. Why not? I mean, what kind of perverse mind would tell you that? Because we know turning to God works. But we're brought up from the time we're small children to become self-sufficient. And you come into Alcoholics Anonymous and they go, you can't win on self-sufficiency. Well, that's bad news. I mean, that's the only thing I know how to do. And so, with this problem that I'm facing next week, what I do is go, God, you're going to have to jump in the middle of this. Because I sure can't determine an outcome here. And I'll go do the best I can, which means I'll participate. Okay? I'm going to go down there and I'm going to do a sales job on them and I'm going to do all the rest of this and give them more than they want and give them a solution to the challenge that they presented me with. And but God's going to have to determine the outcome. And I know, let me ask you a question. In the time that you've been sober, have you ever not had a roof over your head? Have you ever not had a meal? Really? Have you ever not been surrounded by a host of friends?
No. I understood the question wrong.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, if God's been there all the time, where the hell do you think He went? At some point, agnosticism is thinking, well, there's probably God, but it doesn't have a lot to do with me. And I don't think there's a personal God because He's way too busy frying other fish or whatever. And so that's our agnosticism, and then we fall back into self-sufficiency, and it's one of the worst things we can do because then all of a sudden we get turned inward again. And this whole program is about being turned outward. Selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear are all things that make us turn inward. They make us think about ourselves. We get so focused on ourselves, it's like looking through a periscope at our forehead. All I can see is me, and that means I can't think about you unless it has something to do with me. So, that's why part of the third step prayer is relieve me of the bondage of self. So, let's talk. When the book discusses the third step, it says this: selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our problem. Driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-pity, whatever all that says. We step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate, seemingly without cause. Jesus, if you had somebody stepping on your toes, what are you going to do? Say thank you? So I have to, what this book asks me to do is to make a decision to live by spiritual principles. And so it tells me that my disease are all these manifestations of self, which includes fear. The biggest problem in Alcoholics Anonymous is self-centered fear. If you don't believe that, think about if you ever worry about someone else's welfare. If we're afraid, most of the time it's about us. I mean, I don't spend my day in fear about what's going to happen to somebody else. So what it does is there's a prayer in here. Now, the prayer is this: God, I offer myself to Thee to build with me and to do with me as Thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self that I may better do Thy will. Take away my difficulties that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help. Thy love, Thy power, and Thy way of life. May I do Thy will always. That's the prayer. And so my sponsor says, I want you to go home and think about this for a week. And then I want you to come back and tell me if you want to do it, but I want you to understand this thing before you do it. And the book says that. It says, we thought well before making this decision, knowing that we could at last abandon ourselves utterly to Him, to God. Now, that's nice, but the more you think about it, the worse it seems. So I'm sitting there and agreeing to something that I'm not sure I want to agree to. And so it says, God, I offer myself to Thee to build with me and to do with me as Thou wilt. That means God gets to do anything. Anything. Let your mind play with that. Live, die, here, there, wind up anywhere doing anything. Am I willing to do that? Am I willing to say, whatever you got in mind, God? Tell me what you got in mind first. See, because I have this inclination to go to the worst possible scenario instantly, what do you think I'm going to do with that? So my sponsor's telling me, when you come back, you will need to do this wholeheartedly. And you need to be willing to experience the consequences of this decision. Okay. So first and foremost, I need to go to God and say, whatever you got in mind. Anything. Up to and including killing me right here, right now. Am I willing to experience the will of God in spite of it? Now here we go, making you guys think again. So, am I willing to do that? And then it says something really neat. It says, relieve me of the bondage of self that I may better do thy will. My bondage is self. It's because of selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. I can't ever get out of my own head. I spend my whole life pole vaulting over mouse turds. I just, everything, if I am obsessed with myself, everything becomes a big deal. You wonder why AAs are so dramatic? It's because they got their heads stuck so far up their ass. We're so obsessed with ourselves that everything is of utmost importance. And none of it is. It's just this obsession with ourselves that we have, which is the hallmark of alcoholism. So, relieve me of the bondage of self that I may better do thy will. I couldn't do God's will unless the obsession with myself is lifted. I just can't. I can't come here and try and be of help to you unless I can get out of my own head. Take away my difficulties. Now there's a good one. I love that part. Take away my difficulties. That victory over them may bear witness to those I would help. Just change the deal. Take these things away not because I want to feel better. Take these things away so I can help somebody else. Let them look at me and see that 37 years ago I was a helpless, hopeless alcoholic that had been drinking a fifth a day for 15 years and was a stumbling, bumbling, slurring alcoholic who was on my way out. And see that isn't where I am today. And see that God created something else that was radically different from what that was. And so I can bear witness. Bearing witness means being an example. Okay? So let me be an example. Take away these difficulties so I can be an example to people about God's love and God's power and God's way of life. So my sponsor sent me home and said, think about all that because you're going to have to agree to it. And I'm not talking about some kind of half-assed deal where you just kind of go, okay, but don't like it much, but I'll do it anyway. Okay? My experience is that God takes this step a whole lot more difficult, a whole lot more seriously than most people who do it. You know, a lot of people just casually do this. I wouldn't do this casually for anything. Okay? If I go in there and make a deal with God, you better assume God's going to be serious. Otherwise, you may get a really rude surprise. So I went back a week later, and my sponsor said, do you want to take this step now? And I said, no. And he said, why not? And I said, I don't want to give God that kind of power in my life. I'm just agreeing to way more than I want to agree with. And he said, then I can't help you. And I said, wait a minute. I didn't say I wasn't going to do it. I said I didn't want to do it. And he said, well, then get on your knees with me and hold my hands, and we'll say the prayer, or you say the prayer, but you better be serious about it. I said, okay. So I got on my knees and I said this prayer, holding his hands, and then I got up and he laughed at me, which I thought was wholly inappropriate. And I said, what's so damn funny? And he said, you don't want to give God that kind of power in your life? And I said, right. And he said, Bob, God's got all the power anyway. Power is an illusion for you. So it isn't like you're giving anything away. He said, all this is an exercise in who's God and who's the drunk. So, here's what's happened over the years. The first time I took it, I was terrified of it because it was told to me that this was serious business that could affect the rest of my life, and that I better think well, which is what the book says, before making this decision, knowing that I could at last abandon myself utterly to God. You know what? I spent 4 years in the Navy. Abandon is a really important word in the Navy. Because if you're standing on a ship that happens to be sinking, you better get the hell off and get the hell away. I was on a 760-foot heavy cruiser. And when those things go down, they have the ugly habit of creating an undertow. And the first thing they teach you in the Navy is how to swim 100 yards. And you need to swim 100 yards away from that ship so you don't get caught in the undertow, and you could be out there 20 feet away from the ship, and it goes down and it just drags you with it. And then you aren't coming back up because you can't hold your breath that long. So I understand the term abandon. And that means get off and get away. Get out of self. It says abandon yourself. Okay? So I have to abandon self to God. The second, after I started taking it, I would say the prayer and mean it. And I wasn't quite as afraid of it after, when I was like 5 years sober or something. And then, today, if I'm going to do the third step prayer, which I do once a year, right in front of writing inventory. Usually with someone that I'm taking through the steps, I just go through with them. And then we swap fifth steps and do all that stuff. But today, what I do in two places in this program, the third step and the seventh step, is virtually throw myself at God's feet. Virtually just abandon self. Just say, I don't care. I don't want to. Do you know why we do this? We do this to change. We do this. We go back through the steps because we're tired of being who we are. Now, if you tell me that you don't experience that, I don't know what kind of drunk you are. But periodically, and about once a year that is for me, that I just don't want to be myself anymore. The problem with self is that it's resurgent. It comes back. It's like the ego. You know, all of a sudden, I'm running the same bullshit I was running before. And the ego is resurgent, and what Bill Wilson said was the ego was the enemy, and all of a sudden I'm doing selfish, self-centered, self-seeking things. I'm in fear. I've got some of the bedevilments again. You know how I can tell when I need to go write inventory? I start talking to myself. I speak under my breath. Well, you son of a bitch. When I start talking under my breath, I got to go write inventory. Because all of a sudden, all that stuff's coming back. And I'm running around being angry and upset, all this stuff, frustrated. And so when I do the third step, I just go, I say the prayer, and I am willing to have anything happen. Anything. And first and foremost, I'm ready to expire right on the spot. I don't care anymore. I'm so tired of being me. I just want the whole thing to stop. So I ask God to let me be reborn. That term's offensive to me because I had some challenges with born-again Christians. And the book says we were reborn. Now my 20-year-old son is a born-again Christian, and he tells me I'm going to go to hell, and I tell him I'm going to miss him. And I respect his religion. I do. And I am absolutely delighted that he has it, because it forms a basis for a life based on principles. And I don't care if he thinks I'm going to hell. I believe what I believe, he believes what he believes, and that's fine. And if he's right, it's okay, I tried to do the right thing. So, whatever. So, at the end of the third step, it says that it would have little permanent effect unless it's at once followed by a rigorous attempt to clean the house. And I read that, and my sponsor said, "What do you think that means?" I said, "Well, I'm not sure." He says, "What it means is that it's going to wear off if you don't write inventory." And I went, "Well, that's not very nice." I always sort of hoped that there was some rest stop somewhere in this process where you could kind of sit back and relax and consider what you'd been through and take a few months off and then come back and start over, start where you left off. There is no spot like that. Let me tell you one of the strongest expression in the book from my perspective. Here's the strongest statement in the book. With all the earnestness at our command, we beg of you. How often have you seen somebody get so desperate they had to beg? Actually, alcoholics do that. We beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. When's the very start? Huh? When you come through the door. So if you see someone coming into Alcoholics Anonymous and they're struggling and they're telling you about it, because they normally will, do you tell them, why don't you wait till you kind of get both feet on the ground and, hang around here for a while and look and see if you find anybody you like, and if you find a buddy around here, you can ask him to work with you, but I don't think you're ready. You're still pretty sick. I think you probably ought to wait a year or so before you really get involved in the recovery program. You ever hear anybody say that? Oh my. Don't ever assume that a new person isn't ready to recover. And don't ever assume that they're so sick that they can't do it. And don't ever assume that their intuition doesn't work. All right? Because they're all mistakes. And when we have new people come into our group, they get sponsors right now and start at the forward to the first edition. And I don't care how messed up they are. I don't care how sick they are. I don't care how incoherent they are. If the book is right, we need to get after them as soon as they come through the door. Well, how long do you want to wait to recover? Anyone want to ask me, or you got any statements you want to make or whatever about the third step? Yeah, go ahead. Has somebody got a mic here?
Hello? Doug. So anyway, she's going to turn me off.
Can I watch?
Lack of power, that was our dilemma.
I'm holding the mic. What's your salad? Sorry.
What's on?
Did that work?
Oh, okay.
Hey, power.
All right, go ahead.
When I got sober, the very first time, the only time, I was about probably 6 weeks sober when I got to the third step. And when I read that prayer, it was like this big weight was lifted off my shoulders. And I'm a little analytical, so I analyzed every word in that prayer. And what I learned from that was that I can get through anything with God, and then I can help someone else. That was my experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
You were talking about our thinking and our perceptions, and remember I broke my big toe, and I was like 4 months sober, dry, and I went to my sponsor, and I'll tell you, I was in a tizzy about this broken toe, and he says, Kyle, just because you broke your toe doesn't mean you have a brain tumor. 6 months later, I was diagnosed with a brain tumor on my visual cortex, and Dan just laughed hysterically at me and explained to me quite lovingly that it was not related. But that's my thinking, and it was, and so much of it was around the second step, and he told me that that my brain would never tell me the truth about anything, that I needed an outside observer, and that was going to be him, and that when I had an idea, I was to call him, and get clear on it. But he gave me this wonderful gift with steps 2 and 3, and he called them therapy. And for step 2, he gave me what he called river bottom therapy. And he sent me down to Highway 101 where it crosses over the Santa Maria River. And he told me to walk east. And he said, you'll come to a road, and I'll meet you out there. But while you're taking the walk, I want you to come up with your definition of God. And so I did. I came up with this really great definition that I was going to send off to the Pope and the chief rabbi in Israel because they needed to know. And I got out to this road. It was Sway Canyon Road, and Dan was sitting out there in his pickup truck. And he rolled the window halfway down, and he stuck his head out, and he said, "So?" And I gave him this wonderful definition of God, and he shook his head, and he said, "That's way too small." And he rolled up the window, and he drove back to town. That was my first resentment in AA, but he didn't tell me that from 101 to Sway Canyon Road was a 3.5-mile walk. And so I had to take a 7-mile round trip. And I did that 4 times with the same result. My definition of God was always too small. And the last time I took that trip, I took in anger and frustration and fear. And I found myself standing in the middle of this dry riverbed, shaking my fist and cursing at God. And something came over me. I realized that for the first time since I'm 13, I'm talking to God. Probably not the way he'd prefer, but I was talking to him. And I got out to Sway Canyon Road, and Dan rolled his window down and said, "So?" And I told him, Dan, I don't think I can define God. And he says, "I think you're finally starting to understand." And he rolled up the window and he went back to town. One more resentment. But what I got out of that is if I'm going to talk to anybody about this concept of God, I can say one thing and one thing only, and then I need to shut my mouth. And that one thing is, God is. Period. And so he told me that's a good second step. You've done wonderful. Now we need to move into the third step. And I'm involved with this for several weeks, and I go to him one day and I say, "Dan, this third step stuff isn't working. Nothing's getting any better, and some things are getting absolutely worse." And he smiled, shook his head, took me by the hand, called me an intellectual giant with the common sense of a fence post, and took me into his kitchen. And that day he gave me what he called cat shit therapy. And he reached down into his cat box and he pulled out a dried cat turd. And he told me to hold my hand out. And I did. I was sick enough to do whatever he told me to do. And he put that dried cat turd in my hand and he closed my fingers around it. And he asked me what I had in my hand. And I said, "Dan, I have cat shit in my hand." And he asked me how it felt. And I told him it felt very crappy. And he told me, "Why don't you turn it over?" And so I did. And he asked me again, "What do you got in your hand?" And I still had cat shit in my hand. And it still felt crappy. And he says, "Well, why don't you let go of it and go wash your hands?" And it's like I got it instantly. I can spend the rest of my life turning stuff over, and it's going to do me absolutely no good until I let go of it and wash my hands of it. And that has been a practice for me, for 20 years now, that I practice very diligently at letting go of it and washing my hands of it. Because if I give it to God, the assumption is God has all the power in the universe to relieve me of it. Why the hell do I want to grab a hold of it and take it back? I didn't want it in the first place. So that's just my experience with 2 and 3.
Good story.
My name's Bridget. I'm an alcoholic. And thank you, Bob, so much for everything and for your presentation with the steps. I really love the part where it says, in the third step where you said, "Take away my difficulties so it may bear witness to those I would help with thy power." And a couple of years ago, I had been diagnosed with late-stage melanoma cancer, and I was never sick a day in my life. And I went from the diagnosis to death to never seeing my daughter get married to my husband getting a new trophy wife. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I called my sponsor and I told her, the diagnosis that I was going to die. And she said, well, Bridget, that's not happening today. And then during that course of time, with 1 month, many doctor's appointments, not knowing if I was coming or going, she had me calling her every day, and I was staying really close to God. And the amazing thing that happened with that was what kept me going through was that's not happening today. And turning it over every single day. And walking through it on the other side, even though it was so difficult and horrifying, I was still able to function. I had more commitments than ever in AA to go do things, and I would be like, how do I go to these things and be like everything's normal? And she said, Bridget, you just go and let people know the truth of what's going on. And I did, and it did come to pass. And so what it taught me was a lot of things that changed my whole life, in addition to, how the sobriety already did. But I was able, it's easier to talk about faith when things are going smooth, instead of, she would just say, Bridget, life's in session, and life is difficult. But with God, you can turn it over and know that things are as the way they are for a reason. And I've been able to help many other people with that. For me, I'm not saying that cancer is a byproduct of this, but for me, it was a resentment turned inward at myself. And I did not drink. However, the resentment was killing me. And so I was able to take a look at that and help other people with doing this too. And thank you very much for your time that you took to be here with us too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For those of you who are here today who weren't here last night, this thing right here was surgery I just had on Tuesday to remove a 2-inch tumor on my chin. And when we get to the fear inventory, I want to talk about that. One of the things, I think, one of the most valuable things that my sponsor told me was something that I really didn't like. My sponsor had been in and out of 3 penitentiaries. He had never gotten out of the 9th grade. He was a guy that wandered around. He was a drug dealer at one time. He was not. And I studied chemical engineering and had a corporate job with a lot of responsibility. And then he'd tell me things, and it was hard for me to listen. And one of the things that he told me he died about 4 years ago. One of the things that still rings in my ears is the same question that he asked over and over and over again. And the question was, how the hell would you know? And every time he said that to me, I was offended. And I was thinking, well, I'm a really bright person. That's how I know. And he was right every time. I would give him, I'd go, let me tell you what's going on. And here's what's going to happen. And the same question came out of his mouth, how the hell would you know? And it was rarely, if never, that what I assumed was going to happen would happen. So I do that with my sponsees. They'll come up and go, Bob, I'm going to get fired. And you go, how the hell would you know? And I go, well, because my boss is really mad at me, and maybe he's trying to help you change. Maybe he's having a bad day. Maybe it doesn't have anything to do with you. Things rarely do. Yeah. You know, most things have absolutely nothing to do with me. Really, I'm pretty irrelevant to this whole process. I think the term self-centered, which comes up a lot in this program, is about thinking you're the center of the universe. And that means everything has something to do with me. Okay? It's not. I am a very small part of this. Has anybody else got any experiences with their third step they want to talk about?
Thank you. I do, and I share this because the big book also talks about sometimes it comes quickly and sometimes slowly. And, I have found that I'm in the minority here a little bit, but my spiritual experience was one that came quickly to me. When I came at Alcoholics Anonymous, I had figured I was done drinking. I was done. I couldn't do it anymore. I was done. And I heard the definition of the word done just a couple of weeks ago, and that means completely cooked. And so I was completely cooked. And what I did was that I did hear certain things when I came into the meeting. It took me about a week to get to the place where I could hear something. And about 3 weeks into it, we went to the meeting after the meeting. I went to the meeting before the meeting during the meeting, and the meeting after the meeting. And this was about 11 o'clock. And now I had worked the first step, and I had not even thought about step 2 and step 3 yet. I was just showing up. And I went to coffee with these guys, and while we were having coffee, we were BSing about this and that and everything else. And I had probably had about 15 cups of coffee in me about that time, and it was about 11:30, and these guys were saying goodbye. And one of them said to me, he said, "Hey, Ted, now you have a phone list, right?" I said, "Yes, I have a phone list." He goes, "Well, have you called anybody on that phone list?" And I said, "No, I haven't called anybody from that phone list." He goes, "Well, when you get home, you call somebody." I said, "Okay." And I said, "Bullshit, I'm not going to do it." That's exactly what I said when I got into my car. And I had about a 5-mile drive to my house. And all I could hear in my head was this guy's voice saying, "When you get home, call somebody. When you get home, calling somebody." Now, by the time I got home, I'm slamming the steering wheel saying, "I'm not going to call anybody. I'm talking to myself. I'm not calling anybody." And I went into my house. And when I got sober, they had phones that hung on the wall at that time, and they had cords that you had to pull, and I lived in a very small house, and I walked around this telephone for, I would say, no less than 30 times. And by the time I got to that phone, I was cussing at the phone. And this is self-will. This is self-will. And so about one of the occasions, I finally went by the phone, had the list of phone numbers down there, and I dialed a phone number, and a guy named Harry T picked up the phone. And this is about 2 o'clock in the morning, mind you. Now, I'm not, coffee high and everything else. And the only thing that I heard on the other line was, "Hey, Harry, this is Ted McTighe. I need to call somebody." He goes, "Welcome aboard, Teddy." And I tell you right then, I can tell you that you either can identify with this or you can't. But at that time, that room lit up like I've never seen a room light up before. And I felt a lightness on my feet, and a feeling that I get goosebumps even talking about it today. And that I had the realization that I was in the presence of something a hell of a lot bigger than me. And what that did to me was, in the process, is that, I began to hear things I'd never heard before. I began to tell people about this experience, and people who had experienced it would say, "Right on." People who hadn't experienced it would say, "You're nuts." And it didn't matter to me. It didn't matter. It didn't matter to me at all. But what happened to me was that the following day or two, I got myself a sponsor, and I started on vigorous action. I started taking the steps. Now, I can tell you what happened was that, as I started working the steps and as I started going, I would have to say I was working them fearlessly. But I was working the steps. And what happened was that over a period of time, that feeling of ease and everything else began to leave me after I worked the steps, after a certain amount of time. And I'm talking about close to maybe a year and a half. And what happened was that I believe that my ego started to return, and my self-centeredness started to return, and I started to do the same things that I used to do before I was sober, but I just wasn't drinking. And so what happened to me was I began to work the steps again. But I share that because I don't hear that often. where people have had that Bill Wilson experience. Or when they do, I always have to go up to them and tell me about it, would you? But I don't live on that experience. That was an awakening, a spiritual awakening. And since then, I've had spiritual experiences based on the educational variety. And so I've been sober long enough to know that I've been in the fetal position while in sobriety, and I've been on top of the mountain also at the same time. But know that, in between the two places is the valley. And so I visit the valley on occasion. And I've always got to climb. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lorraine, an alcoholic.
Hi, Lorraine.
And my experience when you were talking about, coming in and getting busy immediately with the program, for me, I had to detox for a long time. Physically, mentally, it took many years for me to detox. Well, not that many. But anyway, I stayed busy. I was doing these things, but they weren't real. But they kept me busy and kept me from going back out. And my third step, I had taken some, change sponsor, take a third. And I was taking a shower one day. And I didn't have my makeup on or my cute mini skirt, or I wasn't talking to the group so they could see how wonderful I was. I was totally alone, stripped naked of everything. And it suddenly dawned on me that I could change my life and that I could do this. And I took the third step in the shower, on my knees, in tears, by myself. And that's truly when I knew that it would work, that God was with me. And it was after that I went out and I seriously looked for a sponsor who would work the steps with me out of the big book. No more of the cute pamphlets that made it nice and easy. So, thank you.
Thank you. Do you know that doing these spiritual exercises does not protect you from life? It prepares you for life. And so the idea that we've somehow, because we've decided to follow spiritual principles, get a free pass is an illusion. And let me tell you that at certain points in your sobriety, you will feel like the whole world's fallen in on you. And there are crisis points, and this is particularly true about people who follow the directions. Now, that doesn't seem fair. But I can tell you that it's not unusual for a person at 5 or 7 years or somewhere around in there to experience a almost catastrophic experience. When I was 7 years sober, I was writing inventory every year. I was doing all this stuff. I was trying to live a spiritual life. And all of a sudden, my business almost went bankrupt. I got sued for $4.5 million by an ex-business partner that I had fired. I got divorced after 17 years of marriage. My kids stopped talking to me, my car burned up, and all that happened in about 6 weeks. And I'm thinking, I must have done something to really piss God off. And I didn't have the slightest idea what it was. And see, I went to this guy that I didn't particularly like, but that I respected, and I said, what the hell's going on here? And he said, what's the matter? Somebody changed all the rules, Bob? And I said, yeah, they changed all the rules. I'm doing everything that I did before, but it doesn't seem to work. And he said, it's just another form of God's presence. And he said, I guess you have to grow in understanding and effectiveness, and maybe you were so locked into what you believed that God has to sort of jerk you out of there to open your mind. I didn't appreciate the experience. And so what happened was that I got a better business, and the last 10 years of that marriage hadn't worked anyway, and my kids I have a much deeper relationship with today, and financially it all worked out, and I just don't want change. If I get comfortable, leave me the hell alone. And God's going, God's saying, no. If you're going to be part of my army, you're going to have to grow. And the only way you're going to grow is to change. And I don't want to. See, I want. This is good. Leave it like this. Yeah. There's this whole theory about, well, it may be a pile of shit, but at least it's my pile of shit. Yes.
Hi, everybody. I'm Beth, and I'm an alcoholic.
Yes.
You inspire such thoughts in me. It's like, okay, which ones are actually going to come out? But when you talk about how horrible we can think of, we have a word for it. We call it awfulizing, and alcoholics are good at awfulizing. And I was thinking that I'm a cockeyed optimist who can awfulize real well. And, everything will be great. No, it's all going to hell. And I had one of those years where my ex-husband had died in December, and I thought I wouldn't grieve him because I already had, but it turns out I had to grieve him a lot, and it was Christmas time, and then a cousin committed suicide in January, and my dad was diagnosed with cancer in February, and it just was a really bad year, and people at my job were saying, don't ask Beth how she is. She'll tell you and you don't want to know. And that was with a lot of sobriety. But the third step thing I was thinking of was when I was new and listening about the step and listening and reading the prayer, and my take on it was, yeah, God, take away my difficulties because then I can help other people. But I'm thinking, but in the meantime, you've removed my difficulties. Wink, wink, nod, nod. And it was like, yeah, remove them for the other guy. But the after effect or the side effect of that is that he's removed my difficulties time and time again, and then he gives me an opportunity to share it. And
right.
It's amazing because, I went through this divorce and I got all these sponsees who had to go through divorce, and I already had some experience, strength, and hope, and that was just one of, so many ways. So thank you.
No matter how far down the ladder we've gone, we see that our experience can benefit others. One of my sponsees is working with a guy who is an over-the-road salesman for this large corporation, and he sort of built his business that way so he didn't have to be with his wife during the week. And as soon as he gets home, she starts berating him. Well, you're no good. You'll never amount to anything. You don't make enough money. You're not a good husband. Da-da-da-da. And that can work either way. I mean, it isn't a gender thing. But I can tell you that my experience with alcoholics is that they settle for so little, and that they'll get engaged in something that's abusive, and they don't want to walk away from it because it may not be the best thing in the world, but at least they have it. And it's followed by this belief that if I don't have this, I can't have anything. And that's just pure unadulterated bullshit. The truth is that God wants all of us to be happy and joyous and free. And see, this lady I was telling you about said, why aren't you dating? And I said, well, right now I'm in the middle of a bunch of things and I really couldn't concentrate on it. But I would rather be alone than to be with someone who treats me with either indifference or contempt or both. You know what? That'll kill you. Do you know I had open heart surgery about 5 years ago? And I think that I had open heart surgery because I was in a marriage that was precisely that. And I thought that I had a responsibility to sit there and be abused. Because I had committed into this relationship and we had 3 kids and I needed to tough it out, and it goddamn near killed me. And I believe here, and I'll start talking about this, but the book says that fear is an evil encroaching thread, the fabric of our existence is shot through with it. And the reason why fear is evil is because it steals everything from you. And the reason why it's corroding is it'll make you sick. And I believe that cancer and heart disease and a whole lot of things are the net result of living that kind of life, where we're abused. You know, if I'm a child of God, that ain't going to happen. And I don't know if you get another chance at this. Maybe this is the only ride you get. And I'm not going to sit in the middle of it and be the target of someone's contempt, because it'll kill me. I don't know what's going to happen to them. Maybe that provides its own reward too, but it'll kill me. And, I was fortunate enough to have a really good surgery and wound up in better shape than I had been for like 20 years. But that kind of stuff would just wear you out. If someone's abusing you, please tell them to go away. Tell them they don't get to make you the target of their anger. Because your life's just going to be miserable, and especially if you have this idea that you're right. You know, one of the challenges that I had in the middle of that was this belief that if my wife felt that way about me, I must really be bad. That I couldn't possibly be worth anything if someone would treat me like that. So the net result is that it must be my fault. No. It's funny, my ex-wife will look at me. We have 3 kids together, so we have a cordial relationship, sort of. And we really do. I mean, because we're both very interested in the welfare of our children. And she'll look at me and she'll go, "Well, you never got married again." And I said, "Nope." And she said, "Well, I sure spoiled that for you." And I said, "No, you don't have that kind of power." And I made my life miserable because I agreed to all that. She's responsible for what she did, but I'm responsible for what I did, and there are no one-way relationships. And so I wound up staying in an abusive relationship and suffered the consequences from it. And I'll be goddamned if I ever do that again, if I have anything to say about it. So please understand that those things can really be harmful to you. And it doesn't make any difference who's doing it. I had a parent that was doing that. And so I didn't hang around with him. And I had a sister that thought it was fun. And my mother, while she was still alive, was saying, "Why don't you like your sister?" And I said, "Because this is what she does." And she said, "Well, she's your sister." And I said, "That's an accident of birth." That's no imperative that I have to care for her. That's just an accident of birth. So I would encourage you, as a child of God, to understand that you have every right to be treated well, to be loved, to be cared for, to be honored. Everyone has that right. And if you're not getting it, you're hanging around with the wrong people. Right? So now we're going to go have lunch.